My John Deere 9600, a venerable titan of steel and faded green, sat by the old barn, a testament to decades of honest work on land my family had bled for generations before this manicured carbuncle of a housing development, Whispering Pines Estates, ever oozed its way onto the county map. Then came the letter, crisp and officious, sealed with the faux gilt emboss of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Violation notice, visual obstruction, it declared, citing Bylaw 7, subsection C, paragraph 2. Unsightly agricultural equipment. My harvester, unsightly, on my ranch. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was a thing of perverse beauty. I almost framed it. Then came Karen Kilpatrick, HOA president, a woman whose entire personality seemed to be a militant adherence to beige. She, or rather her edict, escalated. A tow truck, gleaming and predatory, rolled up my private drive, its amber lights pulsing with a smug, officious rhythm. They were actually going to try and tow my harvester from my land. Karen stood by the newly and illegally erected HOA fence, a flimsy prefab picket affair they'd hammered into my property line just last month, effectively shaving off a good 10 feet of my acreage along the access road. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the John Deere, then at the tow truck driver, a beefy specimen who looked like he wrestled bears for a hobby but was clearly uncomfortable. That, she announced, her voice tight with the thrill of petty dominion, is coming with us. Bylaw enforcement is non-negotiable. I just looked at her, then at the harvester, then back at her. A slow smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, spread across my face. She didn't expect the roar when the 9600's diesel heart coughed, sputtered, then thundered to life. She certainly didn't expect me to engage the headers and aim that 20-foot-wide maw of rotating steel teeth not at any imaginary obstruction, but directly at her brand-new, illegally placed monument to suburban tyranny. The fence disintegrated. Splintered wood and shattered plastic flew like confetti at a particularly grim carnival. Turns out, they didn't own an inch of that land. Their bylaws, their fines, their smug little tow truck, I bulldozed their complaints right out of existence, or at least, right off my property. The silence that followed the harvester's dying rumble was thick, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the faint, strangled gasp from Karen Kilpatrick. Her face, moments before a mask of triumphant righteousness, was now a fascinating study in apoplectic shock, slowly draining of its carefully applied foundation to reveal a mottled, unhealthy red. The tow truck driver, to his credit, had the good sense to look like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, perhaps wrestling that bear. He was already inching back towards his cab, hands held up in a gesture of universal surrender. The remains of the fence lay strewn across what was unequivocally, and now demonstrably, my land. Little white pickets, snapped like dry bones, were scattered amongst the fresh furrows churned by the harvester's tires. It wasn't just a demolition. It was a statement, etched in diesel fumes and shredded timber. Karen's mouth opened and closed a few times, a goldfish gasping for air in a polluted tank. Finally, words, or rather, shrieks, emerged. "You can't do this! This is vandalism! Assault! I'm calling the sheriff!" Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the panic rapidly eclipsing her outrage. I merely leaned against the warm flank of the harvester, wiping a smudge of grease from my hand with a rag I kept tucked in my overalls. "Go right ahead, Karen," I said, my voice calm, almost placid. "Be sure to tell them you sent a tow truck onto private property to illegally seize equipment based on a bylaw that doesn't apply here, after erecting a fence that constitutes trespass and encroachment. I've got my survey maps handy, and a very good lawyer who enjoys these sorts of boundary disputes." My inner monologue, however, was far less placid. It was a cold, precise calculation of the steps to come. This wasn't just about a fence or a fine. It was about the relentless, creeping entitlement of an organization that believed its rulebook superseded actual law, common sense, and basic decency. This fence, this flimsy barrier they'd so arrogantly installed, wasn't their first transgression, merely the most visible. I'd warned them when their survey stakes first appeared, tiny flags of impending annexation. I'd sent a polite, registered letter when the first post was driven. Ignored, of course. Arrogance is a deafness of its own making. My grandfather, who'd cleared this land with mules and dynamite, used to say, "Some folks only understand the language of a firmly closed gate." Or a well-placed no. It seemed the modern equivalent involved a John Deere 9600 and a comprehensive understanding of tort law. Young Michael, my nephew, a whiz kid with computers who leaned more towards conspiracy theories than crop rotation but was fiercely loyal, had already been tasked weeks ago with digitizing every county record, every plat map, every grainy satellite image of our property lines going back 50 years. He'd found gold. The original parcel deeds were ironclad. The HOA's recently filed subdivision plans showed a curious, shall we say, optimistic interpretation of their western boundary, optimistic to the tune of 10 feet of my land. This wasn't just an overreach. It was a land grab, dressed up in HOA beige and flowery legalese. The harvester, now silent, still radiated power. It was more than a machine. It was a symbol of my livelihood, my heritage, and now, my very blunt refusal to be bullied. Karen was still sputtering, phone clutched in a trembling hand, probably speed dialing every number she thought held authority. Let her. The game had just begun, and I always play to win. The following days were a flurry of officious paper and simmering resentment. Karen Kilpatrick, true to her word, had indeed called the sheriff. 2 deputies, young, crew-cut, and looking profoundly uncomfortable to be adjudicating a dispute between a woman wielding a binder of HOA bylaws and a man who owned a very large piece of agricultural machinery, had arrived an hour after the fence's glorious demise. I presented my survey maps, the deed to the property, and a copy of the registered letter I'd sent concerning the illegal fence installation. Their discomfort visibly deepened when I calmly explained the concept of trespass and property encroachment. They listened to Karen's shrill, circular arguments about aesthetic harmony and community standards, their expressions carefully neutral. In the end, they declared it a civil matter, a small victory, but a crucial one. No arrests, no immediate triumph for Karen. Just a recommendation that we all consult our lawyers, which, of course, I already had. My lawyer, a man named Silas Blackwood, was less a man and more a finely honed legal instrument. He had the predatory smile of a shark who just scented blood in the water and the meticulousness of a watchmaker. When I'd initially contacted him about the creeping fence line, he'd merely raised an eyebrow and said, "HOAs. The gift that keeps on giving," to litigators. Michael, my digital ghost in the machine, had meanwhile unearthed a veritable treasure trove. The HOA, it turned out, hadn't just been optimistic with their boundary lines, they'd failed to file for the correct permits for the fence installation with the county planning department. A minor oversight, perhaps, to some. To Silas, it was an engraved invitation. We also found minutes from an HOA board meeting where Karen had pushed through the fence project with minimal discussion, citing urgent beautification needs. The contractor who'd installed the fence, her brother-in-law's fledgling company, awarded the no-bid contract at a price that seemed rather inflated for flimsy picket fencing. Nepotism, potential fraud, permit violations, trespass, and property damage. Silas had purred over the phone after reviewing Michael's findings. It's a symphony of actionable stupidity, my friend. We shall compose an overture of legal unpleasantness. The first step was a meticulously crafted cease and desist letter, delivered not just to Karen but to every member of the HOA board. It detailed their illegal fence, the trespass, the attempted illegal seizure of my harvester, the associated fines, which were, of course, null and void, and hinted darkly at further legal action, including damages and recovery of legal fees. It also included copies of the relevant county ordinances they'd violated regarding permits. The beauty of it was its cold, irrefutable logic, backed by documented evidence. This wasn't just a farmer mad about his fence, This was a calculated dissection of their incompetence and overreach. I imagined Karen's face as she read it, the color likely rivaling the red of my John Deere. The quiet satisfaction was a balm. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about reasserting a fundamental truth. My land, my rules. And the rules stopped where my property line began, a line they had so arrogantly and foolishly crossed. The fight was far from over, but the first volley had been fired, not from a harvester this time, but from the far more damaging arsenal of the law. The HOA's response to Silas Blackwood's meticulously crafted missile of legal reproach was, predictably, a masterpiece of indignant bluster and thinly veiled panic. Karen Kilpatrick, it seemed, was not one to retreat gracefully. Instead, she doubled down, her communications taking on the shrill, righteous tone of a zealot facing down heresy. An emergency HOA newsletter was hastily printed and distributed. On suspiciously high-quality paper, I noted, wondering idly if the beautification fund was being creatively reallocated. This newsletter painted me as a rogue element, a disruptive force, threatening the peace and aesthetic integrity of Whispering Pines Estates. It spoke of my violent outburst, referring, I presumed, to the harvesters' surgical removal of their illegal fence, and my flagrant disregard for community standards. There was no mention, of course, of their trespass, their lack of permits, or the inconvenient truth of the property lines. They issued more fines, backdated and creatively worded. Damage to community property, the fence on my land. Failure to comply with board directives, the fine for the harvester. And a new, particularly inventive one, creation of a hostile environment. I almost laughed. If by hostile environment they meant an environment where their illegal actions were met with consequences, then yes, I was guilty, as charged. Silas reviewed their escalating barrage with an almost joyful gleam in his eye. They're panicking, he said, tapping the latest threatening letter with a pen. This is excellent. Every misstep, every overreach, every piece of defamatory nonsense they publish is another nail in their legal coffin. Keep meticulous records. We'll let them build our case for us. My nephew Michael, thriving in his role as my clandestine intelligence operative, had set up discreet surveillance, strictly legal, of course, focusing on public access points and utilizing long-range lenses. Nothing intrusive, just observation. He captured footage of late-night HOA board meetings at Karen's house, the hushed, urgent tones barely audible but the stressed body language speaking volume. He also, quite brilliantly, managed to get his hands on the HOA's financial statements through a publicly accessible online portal they'd clearly forgotten to secure properly. The numbers told a fascinating story. The beautification fund was indeed robust, but expenditures were often vague, with significant payments made to consultants and service providers that bore a striking resemblance to companies owned by friends and relatives of certain board members, including Karen's brother-in-law's fencing company, which had apparently received several other lucrative, no-bid contracts for landscaping services that seemed to involve very little actual landscaping. This was evolving beyond a simple property dispute. This was about a small-town fiefdom built on petty tyranny and increasingly what looked like outright grift. My resolve hardened. The harvester had been a visceral, satisfying response to a direct provocation, but this required a different kind of machine. A slower, more methodical, but ultimately far more devastating engine of justice. The initial anger had cooled, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. Karen and her board weren't just bullies. They were a symptom of a deeper rot, a casual corruption that preyed on apathy and assumed impunity. They had mistaken my quiet enjoyment of my land for weakness. They were about to learn, in excruciating detail, the difference. The deeper Michael and Silas dug, the more the Whispering Pines HOA began to resemble not so much a community organization as a poorly managed banana republic, albeit one obsessed with lawn height and approved mailbox colors. The financial discrepancies Michael unearthed were more than just suspicious. They were blatant. Significant sums from HOA dues, ostensibly collected for community upkeep, had been funneled into projects with inflated invoices, paid to entities directly linked to Karen Kilpatrick and a couple of her closest board allies. The landscaping services provided by her brother-in-law, for instance, included a line item for exotic shrubbery installation phase 1 at a cost that could have reforested a small national park. Yet the only new plants visible around the communal areas were a few wilting petunias. Silas, with the grim satisfaction of a pathologist identifying a particularly virulent disease, began to compile a dossier. "This isn't just about your fence anymore, my friend," he said, his voice unusually somber. "This is potentially actionable fraud, misappropriation of funds. We might need to have a quiet word with the district attorney's office once we have an airtight case." The thought gave me a certain grim satisfaction, but also a sense of disquiet. I was a rancher, not a crusader. I just wanted to be left alone on my own land. But Karen, in her boundless arrogance, had kicked over a hornet's nest, and now the hornets were coming for the whole damn picnic. My protective loyalty, usually reserved for my family and my land, began to extend, reluctantly, to the other residents of Whispering Pines. Many of them were decent people, drawn by the promise of a quiet, orderly community, now unknowingly funding Karen's petty kingdom and her cronies' pockets. They were the silent majority, perhaps grumbling in private but unwilling to confront the HOA dragon. It was time to give them a reason and the means to find their voice. Michael, ever the resourceful tech gnome, suggested a community awareness initiative. He designed a simple, anonymous website, whisperingpineswatch.org, where he began to post carefully redacted, publicly verifiable documents, the ambiguous boundary descriptions from the HOA's own filings, the county permit violations for the fence, and eventually, summaries of the questionable financial transactions, stripped of any accusatory language, just presented as items of community interest. No names were named initially, just patterns highlighted. The website included a secure anonymous tip line. Slowly, hesitantly, a few trickles of information started to come in from other residents. Stories of arbitrary fines, of selective enforcement of bylaws, of requests for financial transparency being stonewalled. The narrative was building. Karen had sown the wind with her high-handed tactics. Now, she was about to reap a digital whirlwind. My role shifted from direct combatant to quiet strategist. The harvester had cleared the physical encroachment. Now, the law, and the truth, would clear the moral and financial ones. The cold, calculated vengeance I initially felt was being tempered by a sense of righteous obligation. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a fight for basic fairness, for accountability. Karen thought she was battling one stubborn rancher. She was about to find out she was battling an idea, and ideas, backed by facts, are far harder to silence than a lone John Deere. The digital seeds Michael had planted with whisperingpineswatch.org began to sprout with surprising alacrity. Anonymous tips turned into hushed conversations between neighbors, previously united only by their proximity and Karen Kilpatrick's oppressive reign. A retired accountant, Mr. Henderson, who lived 3 doors down from the HOA's clubhouse, contacted us through the secure portal. He'd long harbored suspicions about the HOA's opaque bookkeeping, but had been cowed into silence by Karen's notoriously vindictive responses to any questioning of her authority. Armed with the preliminary information Michael had posted, he started his own discreet audit, cross-referencing public filings with the sparse financial summaries the HOA occasionally deigned to release. His findings corroborated Michael's, adding layers of damning detail. The exotic shrubbery installation Phase 1 was followed by an even more exorbitant Phase 2, yet the communal flower beds remained stubbornly barren, save for the aforementioned petunias and a depressing collection of weeds. Silas Blackwood advised caution and meticulous documentation. We need to ensure every piece of evidence is unassailable before we consider involving the DA, he counseled. But more importantly, we need to galvanize the residents. An internal revolt will be far more effective in dismantling Karen's power base than an external investigation alone, at least initially. The upcoming annual HOA meeting, scheduled in 3 weeks, became our target. It was traditionally a state affair, Karen reading pre-approved minutes, the board rubber-stamping her agenda, and most residents either not attending or sitting in bored silence. This year, we planned a different kind of program. Michael, using his uncanny ability to navigate the labyrinth of local bureaucracy, discovered that the county supervisor for our district, a woman named Eleanor Vance, was known for her no-nonsense approach to community governance and had a particular distaste for HOAs that overstepped their bounds. She was, in essence, the reluctant authority figure we needed. Silas drafted a carefully worded letter to Supervisor Vance, outlining the property encroachment, the permit violations, and the growing concerns about financial mismanagement within the Whispering Pines HOA. Backed by a preliminary dossier of evidence, it was an invitation, not an accusation, for her office to perhaps take a closer look. We also began to subtly arm the more courageous residents, like Mr. W.W.O. Henderson, with specific, pointed questions to ask at the HOA meeting, complete with references to bylaw sections and financial line items. The goal wasn't a chaotic shouting match, but a calm, relentless barrage of uncomfortable truths. The silent majority was slowly being forged into rebellion fodder, not through incitement, but through information. My own role remained largely behind the scenes. I was the catalyst, the one who'd kicked the anthill, but the ensuing swarm needed to appear as a spontaneous uprising of concerned homeowners, not a personal vendetta. The surprise reversal was being meticulously choreographed. Karen Kilpatrick would walk into that annual meeting expecting adulation and compliance. She would find, instead, an informed, organized, and quietly furious populace, armed not with pitchforks, but with spreadsheets and inconvenient questions. The sheer, delicious irony was not lost on me. She, who wielded bylaws like a cudgel, was about to be undone by the very rules and records she had sought to manipulate. The stage was being set for a very public reckoning. The community hall, usually echoing with the forced cheer of sparsely attended potlucks, was uncharacteristically full for the Whispering Pines HOA annual general meeting. A nervous energy crackled in the air, a stark contrast to the usual somnolent apathy. Karen Kilpatrick, resplendent in a power suit, the color of dried blood, beamed from the podium, flanked by her loyal, if visibly anxious, board members. She clearly mistook the crowd for an outpouring of support, perhaps a response to her newsletter demonizing the rogue rancher next door. Her opening remarks were a masterclass in self-congratulatory rhetoric, lauding the board's tireless efforts in maintaining community excellence and fiscal prudence. Then came the agenda item: open forum for homeowner concerns. This was usually a perfunctory segment, met with silence or perhaps a timid question about recycling schedules. Not tonight. Mr. Henderson, the retired accountant, rose first, his demeanor mild but his voice surprisingly firm. "Madam President," he began, "regarding the Q3 financial statement, line item 4.2, Landscaping Enhancement Project, Phase 2, for 28-0. Could the board provide a detailed breakdown of these expenditures and perhaps indicate where these enhancements are physically located? Many of us have struggled to identify them." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Karen's smile tightened a fraction. "All expenditures are fully documented and approved, Mr. Henderson. We prioritize value and aesthetic appeal." Before she could pivot, Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street stood up. "And the contract for this landscaping and the new fencing project on the western boundary?" she asked, her voice clear and carrying. "Were these put out for competitive bid, as required by Bylaw 14, Section A?" Now Karen's composure visibly frayed. "All procurement follows established HOA guidelines," she snapped, her tone losing its earlier condescension. "These questions are disruptive." Then, from the back, a quiet, authoritative voice cut through the rising tension. "Perhaps I can shed some light on the western boundary issue. Supervisor Eleanor Vance, an unexpected and, for Karen, clearly unwelcome guest, stepped forward. She held a sheaf of papers. "My office," Vance continued, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Karen, "has reviewed the county plat maps and permit filings related to the recent fence installation. It appears the fence was constructed without the necessary county permits and, more significantly, encroaches substantially onto private property not owned by the HOA." The room fell silent. Karen's face was a mask of disbelief, rapidly morphing into barely suppressed fury. Supervisor Vance continued, her tone measured but unyielding. "Furthermore, we've received numerous inquiries regarding the HOA's financial transparency and adherence to its own bylaws. My office will be initiating a formal review." This was the moment. The terse, cold, tactical dismantling I had envisioned, executed not by me, but by the weight of evidence and the voice of legitimate authority. The other board members looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them. Karen, however, tried to rally. "This is an outrage. An interference in private HOA matters. This man," she pointed a trembling finger at me, standing quietly by the refreshment table, "is behind this, with his vendetta." I simply raised an eyebrow and took a sip of my lukewarm punch. The crowd wasn't looking at me. They were looking at Karen, at their suddenly vulnerable board, and at the damning implications of Supervisor Vance's words. The public embarrassment was palpable. A slow, agonizing unraveling of Karen Kilpatrick's meticulously constructed facade of control. The seeds of doubt had bloomed into a garden of open rebellion. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was swift and brutal, at least for Karen Kilpatrick and her enablers. Supervisor Vance's announcement of a formal review by the county acted like a detonator. Suddenly, the silent majority found its collective voice, and it was a chorus of outrage and demands for accountability. Within days, Silas Blackwood, acting on my behalf, and now informally representing a growing consortium of concerned Whispering Pines residents, filed a comprehensive lawsuit. It wasn't just about my demolished fence anymore, though that was certainly a key component, seeking damages for trespass, property damage, and the recovery of costs associated with their illegal fine attempts. The suit also included broader claims based on the evidence Michael and Mr. Henderson had painstakingly compiled: breach of fiduciary duty by the HOA board, mismanagement of funds, and violations of numerous HOA bylaws related to financial transparency and procurement. The legal hammer, long held in reserve, had finally fallen. Simultaneously, the district attorney's office, prompted by Supervisor Vance's referral and Silas's meticulously organized dossier, opened its own investigation into potential criminal misconduct, specifically focusing on the misappropriation of HOA funds and possible fraud related to the no-bid contracts. News crews, scenting blood and suburban scandal, began to appear outside the Whispering Pines clubhouse. Karen Kilpatrick, once the imperious queen of her cul-de-sac kingdom, found herself dodging reporters and facing a barrage of questions she couldn't answer with smug pronouncements about community standards. Her carefully curated world was collapsing. The HOA board, minus Karen, who was abruptly on leave, convened an emergency session. Faced with mounting legal pressure, public disgrace, and the very real threat of personal liability, they capitulated. The illegal fines against me were rescinded, with a formal, if grudging, apology issued. The HOA publicly acknowledged the incorrect placement of the infamous fence and agreed to cover all costs for its complete removal and the restoration of my property line. More significantly, an independent auditor was appointed to conduct a thorough review of the HOA's finances going back 5 years. Karen Kilpatrick officially resigned from the HOA presidency a week later, citing personal reasons. Her brother-in-law's landscaping company quietly went out of business. The reluctant authority figure, Supervisor Vance, played her part perfectly, issuing public statements about the importance of transparency and accountability in community governance, effectively legitimizing the residents' revolt and my initial actions. The victory was not just mine, it was a collective reclaiming of power. The symbolic justice was potent, the fines dropped, the fence gone, the architects of the petty tyranny dethroned. The harvester, which had started it all, sat quietly by the barn, its job done. But the legal machinery, once engaged, continued its relentless work, grinding towards a resolution that promised not just restitution, but a fundamental change in how Whispering Pines was governed. The cold, calculated vengeance had been achieved, not through brute force alone, but through the precise application of law and truth. The dust began to settle over Whispering Pines estates, revealing a landscape irrevocably altered. The disgraced HOA board members, those who hadn't resigned in panic, were voted out in a special election, replaced by a new slate of residents, including a somewhat bewildered Mr. Henderson, who found himself reluctantly drafted as the interim treasurer. His first act was to ensure all financial records were made readily accessible to homeowners online, a level of transparency previously unimaginable under Karen's regime. The independent audit, when its findings were eventually released, painted a grim picture of years of mismanagement and self-dealing, leading to further civil actions to recover misappropriated funds. Karen Kilpatrick, stripped of her title and her power, became a neighborhood pariah. Her attempts to maintain a facade of normalcy were met with cold shoulders and averted gazes. The legal battles would drag on for her, a slow, public erosion of her finances and reputation. For me, life on the ranch returned to its familiar rhythms. The boundary line where the offending fence had stood was now clearly marked, not with pickets, but with sturdy, traditional wire fencing, well within my property. The John Deere 9600, my unlikely co-conspirator, gleamed a little brighter in the afternoon sun, a silent sentinel of defiance and resolve. It had become something of a local legend, the HOA Demolisher. I even found a small, discreetly placed bouquet of wildflowers near it one morning, no note attached. The new HOA board, chastened and eager to prove its commitment to fairness, approached me, hat in hand, to discuss neighborly relations. I made it clear. Respect for property rights was non-negotiable. They readily agreed. The experience had forged an unexpected role for me within the wider community. No longer just the reclusive rancher, I was now seen, somewhat uncomfortably, as a figure of quiet authority, the man who had stood up to tyranny and won. Other HOAs in the county, I heard, were suddenly reviewing their own bylaws and financial practices with a newfound sense of urgency. The reluctant warrior had, it seemed, inadvertently started a small revolution of common sense. My family, initially worried by the escalating conflict, now viewed the entire episode with a mixture of pride and amusement. Michael, my tech-savvy nephew, had already moved on to investigating rumored irregularities in the county's water district allocations, his appetite for uncovering hidden truths whetted. The tactical justice fantasy had played out not with explosions and dramatic confrontations in the traditional sense, but with the steady, relentless pressure of documented facts and legal process. The emotional undercurrent of cold, calculated vengeance had found its catharsis, not in Karen's ruin, but in the restoration of order and justice. There was a somber resilience in that, a protective loyalty to principles that had been vindicated. As I looked out over my land, the setting sun casting long shadows from the barn, I allowed myself a small, dry smile. HOAs. Perhaps Silas was right. They truly were the gift that kept on giving. But sometimes, you had to give a little something back, preferably with an agricultural implement and a good lawyer. The new fence stood as a quiet testament to that. A boundary clearly defined, a lesson learned, and the porch light on my old farmhouse, once a beacon in the rural darkness, now also symbolized a return to control, a hard-won peace.